Part 1, the email. Amal, where my deployment, I was halfway through my deployment when everything I thought was stable in my life collapsed into a digital file. It happened on a Wednesday around noon. The desert sun was unrelenting, the kind that made the tent feel like an oven. I had just returned from a patrol, dusty, exhausted, and ready to cool off with a bottle of warm water and silence. I opened my laptop, out of habit, expecting maybe a message from my unit's admin or a quick note from home. What I got from an email from Becky, subject line, "Let's handle this like adults." That line alone should have warned me. But I clicked it, still believing in some naive part of myself that it was something small. A complaint, a request, maybe even a check-in, disguised in her usual sarcasm. Instead, 3 sentences ended 13 years of marriage. She'd filed for divorce, the paperwork was attached, our joint account was empty. Also, she'd moved someone named Jeremy into our house in Spokane, our home. I read it twice. Then a third time. I didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't even speak. I just closed the laptop, stood up and walked to the communal showers, but the water was barely more than a trickle. The grime came off easier than the numbness. I dried off, got dressed, and reported to my shift as if nothing had changed. Because on the surface it hadn't. The mission still required me, the team still needed me, focused. I didn't say a word to anyone. That night, back in my bunk, I opened my laptop again, typed a one-word reply, "Understood," and hit send. There was no point in questions or arguments. She had made her choice. Wilson, the guy in the bunk across from mine, must have sensed something was off. He glanced over his book and asked, "You good, Briggs?" "Is it some stuff back home?" I answered. He nodded. That was enough. Out here, we didn't press unless lives depended on it. And mine, at that moment, didn't seem to matter all that much. But deep down, I wasn't surprised. Things had been slipping long before the deployment. There were signs, subtle at first, but unmistakable in hindsight. The emotional distance, the secretive behavior, but I hadn't confronted her. Not out of denial, but because I needed to be sure. I'd learned long ago not to act on suspicion alone. Patience was part of survival. Now I realized my marriage hadn't collapsed in a single moment. It had eroded quietly until only paper and silence remained. That email wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the final page of a book I didn't know she'd already finished reading. Part 2, Emotional Shutdown. The days that followed blurred together. Outwardly, I kept moving. Drills, reports, patrols, meals. But internally, it was like standing still in a blizzard. Everything I'd spent over a decade building had been quietly dismantled behind my back, and now all I had were desert sand, duty, and silence. No one said much. Maybe they sensed I wasn't up for conversation. Or maybe they'd seen it before, guys coming apart from the inside, quietly. You learn to spot it in this life, the way someone stares a little too long at the ground, the delayed response when their name is called, the late night walks when no one else is awake. But I wasn't breaking, not yet. I was going into a kind of lockdown mode, not unlike what we did during a direct threat. Emotionally, I sealed all the exits. Anger, grief, confusion, they were circling me like wolves, but I wasn't letting them in, not until I had a plan. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was how efficient she'd been. No hesitation, no conversation, just execution. She'd filed the paperwork, drained the accounts, and replaced me with someone else, all within the span of a few weeks, like swapping out furniture. There was no fight, no attempt to fix things, not even the courtesy of a phone call. I thought back to the weeks before I deployed. Things had already felt off. She had stopped asking about my work, stopped showing up at family calls. She had started spending more time out with friends I had never met. New clothes appeared in her closet, her phone was glued to her hand, and always face down when I walked into the room. I think at the time I didn't push. I've never been the type to snoop through phones or follow someone to see if they're lying. That's not how I was raised. My father taught me to give trust freely, but if it's broken, walk away with your dignity intact. Still, even then, something in my gut had started whispering. I didn't ignore it. I just didn't act right away. Instead, I started quietly preparing. Because if my instincts were right, I knew I'd need a fallback. I moved my valuables, the watch my grandfather left me, my mum's silver, my military records, into a rented storage unit under my name. I opened a separate bank account and routed a part of my pay there. Nothing major, just enough to have some breathing room if things went south. On the other hand, as I remember staring at my locker, its dented metal reflecting the low overhead lights, my name was stenciled across the top, Briggs, like it always had been. That was the only part of me still untouched. Everything else, husband, partner, home, had been stripped away. But I was still a soldier, and I knew how to regroup. Part 3, precautions taken. They say hindsight is 20/20, but for me, the signs weren't just visible in retrospect. I'd noticed them while they were happening. I just chose not to confront them head on. Not yet, because confrontation is loud, messy, and once you open that door, you can't close it again. Instead, I planned, quietly, carefully, like I would for any other mission. I knew better than to accuse someone without proof. And even more, I knew that if things really were falling apart, I'd need options, a backup position, a fallback zone. That's how we survived in the field. It made sense to do the same at home. First came the documents, all the essentials, my birth certificate, our marriage license, the deed to our house, which thanks to the VA loan was under my name. I gathered them all and stored them in a secure unit across town. The place was small and anonymous, just another concrete box with a padlock, but it held the pieces of a life I wasn't ready to let get lost in someone else's storm. I added my military benefits paperwork, my service records, a few valuables that mattered for more than their price tag, my grandfather's old pocket watch, worn smooth from age, and a collection of old family letters my mum had kept before she passed. Becky had never really cared for those things, and I wasn't going to risk her tossing them in a fit of convenience. Next came the financial steps. I found a small credit union that Becky didn't know about, and opened an account in my name only. Nothing flashy, just enough to divert a portion of my paycheck. I didn't reroute everything, just a safe sliver. Enough to ensure that if our shared finances went up in flames, I wouldn't be left with nothing. She didn't notice, or if she did, she never said anything, which in hindsight was its own kind of answer. I also looked into the terms of our VA mortgage, something most couples never think about unless they're buying or selling, but I wanted to know exactly how exposed I was, what she could do without my consent, and where the legal lines were drawn. That bit of research would prove to be one of the smartest things I ever did. The final thing I moved was less tangible, my mental expectation. I stopped assuming we were forever. I still loved her, still hoped things would come around, but I began carrying that hope like a fragile item in a deployment bag, not packed at the bottom, just loosely wedged in, ready to be discarded if needed. When I think back to that phase of my life, it wasn't cowardice that kept me from confronting her. It was a calculation. I didn't want to accuse her before I was sure. I didn't want to destroy something that still might have been salvageable, but I was ready. I was ready for war, even if it came from home. Part 4, Marriage Backstory. We met on a warm evening in 2010 at a backyard barbecue thrown by a mutual friend in Spokane. I was on leave between deployments, crashing at my buddy Jason's place, drinking beer out of a red Solo cup, and pretending I wasn't already thinking about my return to base. Becky showed up late, wearing jeans and a hoodie with a college logo, hair in a ponytail, not trying to impress anyone, and that, ironically, made her stand out. She was finishing up nursing school at the time, though later she took an admin job at a dental practice instead. Less stress, she said, and I didn't question it. We weren't opposites exactly, but we came from different corners of life. Her father had worked his whole career at a bank, her brother was a pharmacist. She was small-town stable, all structure and planning. I was a soldier raised by a mechanic and a school teacher, never quite sure where I'd end up next. We got married 8 months later. In those early years, Becky used to tell people how proud she was of my service. She'd show off photos of me in uniform to her friends, attend the occasional ceremony when timing allowed, but I could tell she never fully understood it, not just the danger, but the calling. To her, the military was a stepping stone, something I'd eventually grow out of once I figured out what I really wanted to do. What she didn't see was that this was the thing I wanted to do. Not because I liked danger or war, no one sane does, but because it gave me structure, purpose. In the army, I wasn't just someone's husband or someone's son. I was someone who mattered to a team, to a mission. That kind of belonging doesn't come easily in civilian life. We bought the house in 2014, modest 3 bedrooms tucked away in a quiet neighborhood near the outskirts of town. The VA loan was in my name as required, but I added Becky to the deed because that's what married couples do. We weren't just sharing bills, we were building a life. My father passed away not long after a heart attack while clearing snow from the driveway. He'd been strong, stubborn, the kind of man who didn't stop working until his body gave out. My mother followed 3 years later, taken by lung cancer despite never touching a cigarette. They left me a modest inheritance, not enough to make us rich, but enough to pay off our student loans and build a financial cushion. Over the course of our marriage, I deployed 4 times, twice to Iraq, twice to Afghanistan. Every time I left, I felt the weight of absence, and every time I returned, I noticed something different. Becky had changed, a little more distant, a little more guarded. At first, I chalked it up to the strain of being a military spouse, the loneliness, the solo holidays, the uncertainty. But over time, I started to wonder if it was more than just that. One night, a year or so before the final deployment, I mentioned re-enlisting. Becky didn't even look up from her phone. I didn't sign up to be married to the army, she said flatly. I'm tired of being alone. I understood where she was coming from. Really, I did. But her words hit like a silent door closing behind me, because what she didn't realize was that the army wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. And she was already walking away from it. Part 5, the financial blow. 2 weeks after that email, I was sitting in the mess hall when my phone buzzed with a bank notification. At first I assumed it was a standard alert, maybe an automatic deposit or a minor transaction, but when I unlocked the screen and opened the app, I felt my stomach drop. A withdrawal of $88,500, 0 cents had just posted. Gone. Almost everything left in our joint accounts vanished in a single sweep. I stared at the numbers, not sure I believed them. I refreshed the app. Still there, the checking balance read $22.37, our joint savings account, where we'd stashed nearly $47,000, 0 cents for future plans, emergencies, maybe even a family someday, had been wiped clean. Murphy, a guy from my unit, glanced over. Bad news? He asked between bites. That's money stuff, I said, pocket in the phone like I was burning a hole in my hand. That night, I used one of the morale center phones to call our bank. It wasn't easy explaining things from halfway around the world, but eventually I got through to someone who could access our transaction records. As I suspected, the withdrawals hadn't been sudden. Becky had been draining our accounts in small increments for weeks, starting just days after I deployed. At first, it was hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. The large transfers had only begun recently, timed perfectly to avoid suspicion while I was thousands of miles away on military orders. When the call ended, I stood in the dim hallway outside the phones, watching other soldiers laugh on their calls home, talking to wives, kids, parents, friends. The sound of normal life going on. It felt like I was watching it through a pane of glass, unreachable. I'd been betrayed, not just by someone I loved, but by someone I had trusted completely with the everyday parts of life, finances, home, security, and she had used that trust like a weapon. Later that night, Wilson found me alone, seated on the edge of my cot. He sat down across from me, quietly, like someone trying not to spook a wounded animal. Heard from Alvarez that you looked like you saw a ghost at dinner, he said. I hesitated. I wasn't usually the type to talk about personal issues, especially not while deployed, but Wilson was different. He had my back in Kandahar during a close call. That kind of thing built trust quickly. My wife emptied our accounts, I said. Filed for divorce, moved some guy into my house, did it all while I was out on patrol last week. Wilson didn't flinch. He just asked, "What's your plan?" "I'm working on it," I replied. And I was, because if there was one thing the army had taught me, it was how to think through chaos. I might have lost money, but I hadn't lost my ability to act. And I wasn't going to lose what was left of my life without a fight. Part 6, sharing with a brother in arms. There's a strange intimacy that forms in combat zones. You share a tent with men you barely know, but over time, they become something closer than family. You see each other at your most exhausted, your most vulnerable, and sometimes, without even realizing it, you lean on each other in ways no one back home could ever understand. Wilson was that kind of guy. He didn't push me for details. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He just let the silence hang there for a bit, then asked again, "What's the next move?" That question, just 5 words, flipped a switch in me. It wasn't about emotions anymore. It wasn't about pain or betrayal. It was about control. I couldn't undo what had been done, but I could decide what came next. I need to check a few things, I told him. Finances, legal stuff, security back home. "You want me to cover for you?" he asked. "Buy you time?" "Maybe. Just for a few nights. It won't be long." Nodded. "You've got it." That night, I stayed up late, staring at my laptop in the glow of a single dim lamp. I logged into our home security system, something I'd installed before leaving, mostly for peace of mind. Becky probably forgot it still uploaded footage to the cloud. The cameras told me everything I needed to know. A strange truck is in the driveway. A man I'd never seen, walking our dog, using my coffee mug, wearing my Seahawks sweatshirt, the one I kept at the foot of our bed. Becky was in the kitchen, laughing at something he said, leaning against the counter I had installed myself during my last leave. It wasn't the betrayal that hit hardest. It was the replacement, the ease with which my life had been rewritten. I didn't cry. I didn't throw out anything. I just grabbed a notebook and made a list like I would before a mission. Called James, the army buddy turned attorney. Review VA loan terms. Double check pension account security. Run into possible emergency leave. Revisit refinance comment Becky once made months ago. I was no longer reacting. I was planning. Because this wasn't just about heartbreak anymore. This was about reclaiming what was mine. Part 7, investigation begins. By morning, I was running on caffeine and adrenaline. I'd been up most of the night combing through documents, emails, and anything Becky had sent me in the last 6 months. There wasn't much. She'd gone radio silent long before the divorce email, but every now and then something clicked. Like that time she mentioned in passing that our mortgage company had sent some paperwork she needed me to look over. That was 3 months ago. I'd brushed it off, assuming it was standard stuff, rate updates, insurance notices. But now I wondered if that had been the moment she started laying the foundation for something bigger. I messaged James through a secure military email, subject line, "Need legal help, discreet and urgent." He replied within an hour, "Call me, secure line only." James and I had served together during my second tour in Iraq. He'd left the service a few years back and gone into law, focusing on financial and property cases, especially those involving veterans. He was sharp, relentless, and most importantly, loyal. The call was short but intense. "She forged your signature," he said after reviewing the scanned documents I'd sent. "This isn't even a good forgery. Wrong middle initial, inconsistent handwriting. And from what you're telling me, she refinanced the house without your knowledge? Used the equity to pull out over $300,000 0 cents, I confirmed." Jesus, that's straight up fraud. "And she's not alone," I added. "Her boyfriend's living there now. I've got him on camera, walking the dog, drinking from my mug, wearing my clothes." "You're sure about him?" "Not yet, but I'll find out." James agreed to start digging. He had access to property records, loan documents, and court filings. Within 24 hours, he'd uncovered the refinance application and the name of the loan officer who processed it. "There's a second applicant on the paperwork," James said. "Name's Jeremy Ryan. That ring a bell?" I closed my eyes. That's him. He's got a record, by the way. 2 DUIs, 1 fraud charge back in 2019 that got pled down. And so he's done this before? Could be, and your wife listed him as a co-applicant. That's not something you do casually. Excellently, it was starting to make sense, or at least the chaos was beginning to take shape. Becky hadn't just moved on with another man. She'd teamed up with someone who knew how to exploit vulnerable systems and vulnerable people. I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was untangling a web that went deeper than I thought. And I wasn't going to do it alone. Part 3, return and legal discovery. 2 months later, I stepped off a military transport plane onto American soil. I didn't tell Becky I was coming back. I didn't want a scene. I wanted clarity, answers, and maybe, if I was honest, a little revenge, though not the loud, angry kind. the strategic kind. I checked into a motel under a different name, just a few miles outside of Spokane. The room smelt like stale air conditioning and industrial detergent, but it was quiet, anonymous, a good staging ground. The next morning, I met James at a diner on the edge of town. He was already seated, a folder on the table in front of him. He didn't start with small talk. "You look like hell," he said. "Feel like it too." He slid the folder over. Inside were pages of bank statements, property filings, and legal documents. Everything he'd uncovered since our last call, but one page was paper-clipped on top. Take a look at this one first. It was a refinance application. My name was on it, but not in my handwriting. The signature was close, but there were mistakes. The stroke pattern was off, the middle initial wrong. It was a copycat job, enough to fool someone at a glance, but not someone who knew what to look for. "She forged this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. James nodded. 3 months ago, pulled out over $330,000, 0 cents in equity. Used your name, your VA loan, your house. Let me guess, Jeremy's name is in there somewhere too? Co-applicant, which shouldn't even be possible. The VA loan is tied to your service record alone. Whoever processed this either didn't check or didn't care. I gritted my teeth. So what can we do? James leaned back. "First, report it. You got military ID, proof of your real signature, and a forged financial document. That's criminal. Second, we freeze whatever money's left. Third, we challenge the refinance legally. And last, if you're up for it, we use this to launch a wider investigation." I didn't hesitate. Do it all. We went straight to the bank that afternoon. I met with the loan officer who had handled the paperwork, a guy in his 40s with nervous eyes and a nameplate that looked too clean. I showed him my ID, showed him my real signature. Then I showed him the forgery. His face went pale. I don't know how this happened. The application came through digital submission. I assumed. "You assumed wrong," I said, "and now you're going to help make it right." He agreed to escalate the matter immediately and placed a freeze on the account connected to the refinance funds, but it was clear that some of the money had already been moved. James was already working on tracing it. That night, I got a text from Becky. "Who have you been talking to at the bank?" Jeremy said someone was asking questions. I didn't answer. "Not yet." The next day, I filed a formal fraud report with the county clerk's office, challenging the legitimacy of the refinance. We submitted an injunction to prevent any further changes to the property or the mortgage until the issue was resolved. Becky called later that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. "Nathan, we need to talk. The bank called about the house. What are you doing? If this is about the divorce, we can discuss it like adults." Like adults. The same words from the email that started it all. I still didn't respond. I wasn't done gathering ammunition, and this time I wasn't the one exposed. Part 9, the real estate scam. James called me the next morning. "I traced the largest transfers from the refinance account," he said. "Almost 15 grand was wired to a man named Daniel Spencer, real estate agent." "Spencer?" I asked, unfamiliar. He specializes in fast sales, cash offers, low market value deals, flips houses for investors. I felt something click, so they weren't just stealing the equity. They were planning to sell the house, too. It hit me like a sucker punch. The home I'd bought with my VA loan, renovated on weekends between deployments, paid off with inheritance from my parents. That house wasn't just being lived in by a stranger. It was on its way to being sold out from under me. "She was going to get rid of it while I was overseas," I said slowly. "That's not all," James added. "Spencer and Jeremy, your wife's boyfriend, they've done business before. Closed at least 3 similar deals together in the past 2 years. This is a pattern. Looks like it. I also found another woman, divorced, military husband stationed in Germany. House was sold. 6 weeks after she filed, guess who the agent was? Spencer, Inga. And Jeremy Ryan's name showed up on her phone records. So this wasn't just a betrayal by one woman, this was a coordinated scheme. A man who preyed on military spouses, a real estate agent who facilitated the transactions, a system that relied on timing, emotional manipulation, and legal gray areas. "They've been targeting families like mine," I said, my voice colder now. James didn't argue. They see military deployments as opportunity, and if this goes any deeper, we may be looking at something bigger than small-time fraud. I knew I had to act fast. The house wasn't just mine in name. It was my anchor, proof that my service had built something. Yeah, that I'd built something. And now two strangers were about to wipe that away with a few signatures and some photos on Zillow. They're planning to list it within the week, James told me. Cash buyer already interested. I clenched my jaw. They've got to stop it now. I checked the cameras later that day. Becky was gone, probably at work, or meeting Jeremy. A few hours later, the driveway filled with movement. Jeremy was outside. Then the car pulled up with a real estate logo on the side. Slenser. They shook hands and went inside. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. My security system uploaded everything to the cloud. But I opened the app, turned on the interior feed and hit record. Bot 10, the trap is set. I sat in my motel room, phone in hand, watching my own living room unfold on screen. The camera's angles showed everything. Jeremy standing near the fireplace, gesturing like he owned the place. Daniel Spencer walked around, snapping pictures, asking about square footage and interior features. He had a clipboard and confidence like this wasn't his first time selling a house that didn't legally belong to the seller. The audio came through clearly. We'll list it at $470, Spencer said. I've got a buyer ready to go, cash as usual. We tell him the seller wants a quick close, he offers $420, everyone's happy. What about the husband? Jeremy asked. Becky says he's starting trouble. Spencer waved a hand. Military guys make noise, that's all they do. They got deployments, duties. Court is the last place they want to be. He'll probably just take a settlement to make it go away. I paused the feed and replayed that last line. He'd just take a settlement? So I forwarded the live security footage to Agent Patel from the FBI. Subject line happening now. James and I sat parked down the street, engine off, eyes on the house. He was already recording from his phone, just to have a second copy. My hands were steady. I wasn't nervous anymore, just focused. This is the part where it all turns, I said. 30 minutes later, unmarked SUVs began pulling into the neighborhood. Black jackets, earpieces, federal agents. Spencer and Jeremy were led out in handcuffs. I watched it happen from behind the tinted glass of Jamie's truck, jaw clenched, heart strangely quiet. My phone rang. Agent Patel? We've got him on audio. Wire fraud, conspiracy, attempted sale of property without legal ownership, and we've confirmed your signature was forged. And Becky, I asked. She just shows up. Let's shock, but we're assessing her involvement. I saw her from the distance, standing on her lawn, hands over her mouth, watching federal agents carry boxes of paperwork out of the house I used to call home. 13 years of marriage. Gone. But the truth? It was just arriving. Part 11, FBI intervention. The federal building was quiet, sterile. Agent Patel and Agent Donovan led me into a small interview room with beige walls and a humming light overhead. A pot of stale coffee sat untouched in the corner. They hit record and began. They didn't need theatrics. They had evidence, video, documents, signatures, and wire transfers. But what they wanted from me was clarity. The timeline, the motivation, and any indication that Becky was knowingly involved in the scheme. Your statement helps confirm this wasn't just a series of bad decisions, Patel explained. There's structure here, a pattern of targeting military families during deployment windows. Do you believe Becky knew what she was doing? I asked. Donovan glanced at Patel, and then replied carefully, we're still determining her level of involvement, but listing someone with a fraud record as a co-applicant on a loan is a red flag, especially when that loan requires spousal consent. She told me nothing, never even hinted at financial trouble, no conversations about refinancing, no paperwork, nothing. Patel made notes. Did she ever complain about being house poor, mention needing to downsize? I thought for a moment. She did mention it months ago, said the house felt too much for us. I thought it was just stress. They asked more questions, dates, conversations, passwords I might have had access to. I answered them all. At the end, Patel handed me her card. We'll be in touch, but please don't contact your wife or Jeremy. We need to keep this clean. I nodded. Understood. That evening, I drove back to the neighborhood, parked in the same spot I had before. Jeremy's truck, somehow retrieved from impound, was back in the driveway. Becky's car was gone. My phone buzzed. A text from her. We need to talk in person. Meet me at Riverfront Park tomorrow. I showed it to James over breakfast the next day. He took one look and said, don't go. Not yet. Nothing good can come from that. I wasn't planning to, I said, but I want to know what she's really doing while I'm supposed to be meeting her. We drove back to the house at 9:30. At 9:45, Becky left, heading to the park. 10 minutes later, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Real estate logo on the side. Daniel Spencer had returned. And he wasn't alone. Part 12, Becky's Role and Resolution. From our vantage point across the street, we watched the track close. Spencer stepped out of the car, clipboard in hand again. Jeremy came out to greet him like nothing had happened 2 days prior. The arrogance was stunning. They'd been handcuffed and questioned by federal agents, and now they were back, pushing forward like nothing had changed. James leaned over the console. Should we go in? Nicked my head. No need, I've still got eyes inside. I opened my security app. The cameras were still active, still feeding to cloud storage. I tapped into the living room feed and handed the phone to James. Inside, Spencer was pacing, taking new photos. Jeremy was pointing things out, the fireplace, the updated kitchen backsplash I'd installed with my own hands on leave. The audio came through clearly. Released by the end of the week, Spencer said. Offer comes in at 4:20, we close fast. Jeremy nodded. What about the husband? Becky says he's not backing down. Spencer shrugged. The military guys are predictable. They get emotional, then they fold. He'll settle. James was already recording the feed on his own phone. This is it, he muttered. I sent the footage to Agent Patel with 2 words. Happening now. Within 30 minutes, FBI agents were swarming the house. Spencer and Jeremy barely had time to react. The clipboard hit the porch as Spencer raised his hands. Jeremy stood frozen, face white. Neither resisted. My phone rang. Patel again? We have them on tape discussing the fraud. That makes it a conspiracy, wire fraud, and attempted illegal sale of property. They'll be in holding tonight. We'll be contacting you for a formal deposition. Vera nodded. And Becky? She just pulled up. Looks. I glanced down the street. There she was, frozen on the lawn, watching the arrest unfold. Her hands were over her mouth. My house is behind her. Now the scene of a federal operation. What happens to her? I asked. Miss depends, Patel said, on how much she knew and on what you want. I stared at Becky for a long moment. Part of me wanted to scream, part of me wanted answers, but mostly I felt done. What's right, I finally said. Part 13, a new beginning. The case moved quickly after the arrests. Jeremy and Spencer both took plea deals within weeks, each throwing the other under the bus. Their operation wasn't just a one-off, it spanned 3 states, targeted military families during deployments, and involved more than a dozen homes. Mine was just one of them. As for Becky, things were less clear. She claimed Jeremy had manipulated her, said he'd convinced her I was hiding money, planning to leave her penniless, that the refinance was his idea, and she just followed along. And I didn't know whether to believe her. Maybe she'd been pulled into something bigger than she understood. Or maybe she'd seen the money and chosen to ignore the signs. Either way, the FBI offered her a deal. Full restitution of stolen funds, signed confession of forgery, total forfeiture of any claim to the house or my military pension. In exchange, no criminal charges. I agreed. Not because I forgave her, but because dragging her through court wouldn't undo the damage. I wanted distance, not destruction. The divorce was finalized 6 months after the email in Kandahar. No fool. Clean break. On paper, it was unremarkable. Just another failed marriage. But beneath the paperwork was a war zone of betrayal, survival, and quiet victories. On the day the last document was signed, Agent Patel called. Thought you'd want to know. Jeremy Ryan was sentenced today. 8 years. Spencer got 12. I thanked her, hung up, and walked out to the porch of my rental apartment. The air was cool, the sun was low, and for the first time in months, the future didn't feel like an open wound. I sold the house a year later. Couldn't bear to live in it. Too many memories etched into the walls, into the floor I'd refinished with my own hands. I used the money to buy a small cabin just outside Missoula, Montana. 2 bedrooms, 10 acres, a creek out back, no neighbors for miles. I took early retirement. 20 years in uniform was enough. I'd given what I could. I adopted a dog, a German Shepherd named Scout, and started doing carpentry for locals. Nothing big, just honest work, hands in the wood, mind at peace. The silence didn't scare me anymore. It felt earned. Months passed, seasons shifted in the valley. Scout grew from a wiry pup into a disciplined shadow who followed me everywhere, to the workshop, through the woods, along the creek where I sometimes sat with a thermos of coffee and watched the water move without urgency. I didn't talk much about what happened. Most people didn't ask. Folks around Missoula respected privacy like it was sacred. I liked that. They saw my military plates, maybe guessed at the history behind my quiet, but no one pried. They let me start over. Then, one crisp autumn evening, I found a letter in my mailbox, a hand-addressed envelope from Fort Worth, Texas. Inside, a neatly folded page. "You don't know me," it read, "but you saved our home. My husband is Navy deployed. When Jeremy and Spencer tried to run their game on me, the FBI stepped in before the sale closed. They told me your case is what helped them connect the dots. Thank you for fighting when it would have been easier to walk away." I read the letter twice, and then I pinned it to the refrigerator, right next to a photo of Scout as a puppy and an old magnet from Kandahar that somehow followed me through everything. That letter stayed there for months. On days when the silence grew too loud or the memories pressed in too close, I'd read it again and remind myself something good had come of all this, something real. Last I heard, Becky had moved back to Oregon, working at another dental office. Starting over, I guess. I didn't hate her anymore, didn't feel anything at all. She'd made her choices, I'd made mine. As for Jeremy and Spencer, they were still behind bars last I checked. The system, for once, had done what it was supposed to do. But that wasn't what gave me peace. Peace came from something quieter, from building furniture for neighbors who paid in fresh eggs and handshakes, from hiking trails no one else used, from knowing that no matter what had been taken from me, I hadn't let them take everything. Some things I rebuilt, and things I let go. And some things like integrity I kept. Now, when people ask what I do, I don't mention the past. I just say I work with my hands, I live outside of town, I've got a dog. That's enough. It's finally, for the first time in a long time, what I have is mine,